Nigel?
Thank you, Kamala. For me, governance is about purpose. It's about the long-term raison d'etre for the enterprise, and it's not about short-term um, shareholder-driven results. And I am very happy to have this very distinguished group of practitioners and academics involved in the conversation. I'm reminded of Bob's the advice in The Fish Rots from the Head when he says the short-term mission-oriented mindsets and behaviors of executives are often in direct opposition to the long-term legal duties of directors. For me, it's more than legal duty, and as Bob Tricker notes in his book, Corporate Governance Principles, Policies, and Practices, governance is different from management. Executive management is responsible for the running. The directors, the governors, if you will, are responsible for running in the right direction and ensuring that the corporation is being run well. And in that regard, I think in recent times, we have had a change in perspective as to why the corporation exists. Is it to serve the shareholder, or is it to serve a larger purpose, a purpose bigger than profit making? And the evidence suggests that having such a purpose is not in conflict with profit making, but in fact enhances the ability of the corporation to be a lot more successful. So having said that, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to learning as with this learning network and to discussing different perspectives. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kamla, and I'm really looking forward to a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Kamla.
Right. Thank you very much, Nigel. Now, as indicated earlier, the opening remarks for this, our first meeting of the International Learning Network, will be delivered by Professor Bob Garratt. Professor Garratt is an international consultant and academic. He specializes in the review and development of boards of directors and works on 5 continents. He is best known, as Nigel just indicated, for his best-selling book, The Fish Rots from the Head, Developing Effective Directors. His latest book, Stop the Rot, Reframing Governance for Directors and Politicians, is proven a much read during the COVID pandemic. I am very happy now to invite Professor Garratt to take the floor.
Thank you, Kamla. How many dogs do you have? Different types of dogs coming on.
Yes, they're different type. I have a German and I have a little spaniel there, and she's the one who is so noisy. Forgive me for that. I'm going to mute so we don't interrupt your part.
That's good. Right, thanks. Thank you for inviting me back. The response from the 2-day session we ran at the end of November has been terrific. And lots and lots of folk have contacted me and Kamla to talk about things they wish to develop through the nascent learning network. I'm delighted to say. So I will keep this short, which is unusual for me. I'll make 3 points on the things I'm learning immediately, things that have changed the way I'm thinking since November, and then make a couple of other small points before handing over to someone of much more interest today, David Jackson. The 3 points that I've really had to think a lot about since the end of November are the development of this, not ESG, but this EES plus G idea. And that really has got a lot of people in many countries talking about it. So adding the entrepreneurship on the front and then social impact, environmental impact, and then what does that mean for governance, that aspect. So what I've done is revise the paper that I gave at the end of November, and anybody interested can pick that up from CAMLA. That's now available, and it's been through quite a large number of people's thinking who kindly have been criticizing the paper. So it is a slightly changed paper, but the essence is still there. So that's available. The other paper that's available is the 4 stages of board maturity paper, which I wrote a couple of years ago, but that's caused a lot of interest again, and CAMLA is sitting on that if people want it. In fact, after that first point about EES plus G, the next 2 points are really over the number 4. One of the things that's definitely happening in my client base, but in many parts of the world now, is the reconsideration of what corporate governance means. And I therefore take Nigel's points very seriously indeed. That's coming along with one of the things going back historically, which seems to be coming out now, is not just thinking about ESG, but going right back to the purpose of companies, and actually going back to that old Adam Smith saying that the creation of the joint stock companies was a brilliant idea and opened up world trade, but nobody put boundaries around it. And what he called the 4 unlimiteds are now perhaps reaching their apex. And lots of questioning is going on at governmental level and at company level around these 4 unlimited. So we've allowed to our organizations, both public and private, to run with unlimited size, with unlimited life, time span, with unlimited license to do what they want, and therefore with unlimited power. And it's those 4 unlimiteds, which I'm getting a lot of correspondence and ideas around at the moment. So that's the whole essence, I guess, can be focused on this notion of, in future, are we going to see, not just in companies, but in governments, a license to operate? And that's going to be a very interesting debate. The other 4, so that's 4 unlimiteds. The other 4 are from the paper I just mentioned, the board's maturity from the accidental board, where I still get people saying, gosh, my board member, I didn't know that. I was given the job title director, and I thought that was an end to it. So from stage 0 of the accidental board through to the grumpily compliant board, all corporate governance is a load of codes and nonsense and paperwork and restrictions. So grumpily compliant, but you increasingly have to be compliant because of the laws, through to the 3rd stage of the learning board, which is very much what the fish rots from the head is about, and now on to the notion of the integrated board. And that is getting some track, some interest at the moment. And behind all that is a very interesting thing, which I hadn't thought about really since the 1970s and 1980s, which is, what are the thinking styles needed for future directors? And I'm beginning to get a lot of requests for very old papers that we produced in that time. So again, I will tidy those up, and again, I'll give them to CAMLA, or a couple of them at least to CAMLA, to put on her database for anybody who's interested. But the notion of that before, our entrepreneurial model was essentially based on monopoly, and how do we always try and get to a position of monopoly, which we still see in Facebook and Google, and today Jeff Bezos and all the rest of it, on the one hand, and how do we, with the pressure of ESG or EESG now pushing on us, how do we begin to raise our thinking above that rather simplistic model of business to take in the fact that we have these new restraints coming on about environmental impact, social impact, governance impact? So these things are bouncing around at the moment, and I have no immediate answer to them, but there's a lot of interest, and I encourage all people, as we're a learning network, to join in, send their papers, talk to us about it, and certainly criticize the stuff I and others are doing on the net. Very happy for that. And behind all that then, there's this notion of, which again Nigel referred to, the sovereignty of the board, the critical importance of the sovereignty of the board. And that, I think, is really beginning to get some traction at the moment. And within that, the need to have really effective chairmen and really effective board members. And that is in turn beginning to lead on to notions of, well, rather than have the board effectively run out of the chief executive's office, don't we actually need to make sure we have the resources to create a small chairman's office, properly resourced, properly funded, which would allow for the induction and the development of, and the appraisal of board members? And that's the point at which I would like to hand over to David Jackson, because if there's someone in the world who knows an awful lot about that and who has been through, shall I say, a very turbulent 10 years at BP and has been through at least 3 global crises with the BP board, there's no one better to talk to us. David, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all very much indeed for your very, very kind welcome today, and good afternoon to you all. I think the first 15, 20 minutes of this conversation has already highlighted the very real challenges there are for company secretaries and for boards in the present environment which we live, because as Mr. Dillon once sang, the times they are changing, and they really are changing at the moment. And that adds even more focus on what the company secretaries and boards need to be doing. I'd love to be involved in a conversation on purpose and license to operate and various other things, but I think my text this afternoon and this evening is to talk about the evolving role of the company secretary and the concept of the chairman's office that Bob has already highlighted. And these things are, the role of the company secretary is inextricably linked to the role of the chair and the board. And Bob's already mentioned the idea of evaluations and board evaluations and things of that nature, and the way in which boards are developing. And I thought I'd start off and set the tone with the view on board evaluation from my last chairman, Karl-Henrik Svanberg. And Bob's involved in board evaluations, and I'm sure that all of you have been involved in one way or another. They can be a little ritualistic, and sometimes they go through a particular pattern. But Karl-Henrik's view was that actually to do a proper board evaluation, you only need to ask 3 very simple questions. Is the bureaucracy working okay? The papers going out all right? Are the board meetings happening? Are we getting through stuff in the right way? The second question, which is a little more interesting, are we talking about the right things? And the last question is, are we adding value? Is value being added to the business every time that the board and one of its committees meets? Because gone are the days where I think you could have the more ceremonial and rubber stamp approach to boards, but now boards need to add value and must add value to actually carry out the very real tasks with which they're charged. And so I'm going to try and look at the evolving role of the company secretary and the support for the chair through this lens. And in doing so, I'm going to ask basically 4 questions. How has the role of the company secretary evolved? What does the board do? What does the chairman do? And how does the company secretary support the chair and the board? And overall, what does that mean for the modern role of the company secretary and what skills are needed? And I'm going to try and do this in 30 minutes. So I hope this isn't too much of a whistle-stop tour. The role of the company secretary, and clearly I'm speaking from a UK environment, so I know we have people from all over the world listening to this, and different jurisdictions may operate in different ways, but I'm going to obviously speak from my own experience. And in some way, the evolution of the role has followed my own career. I'm actually a lawyer. I was actually counting up. I've been 42 years in the law, and 28 years of those I was a company secretary. And there's been a clear evolution of the role from where it stood in the 70s and the 80s. That's the 1970s and 80s, not the 1870s and 80s. Through, I suppose, from the role where the company secretary was the chief administrator of the company. The idea of the company secretary is the conscience of the company. When I joined Matthew Hall, a construction company in the mid-80s, I was the new kid on the block. I was the new in-house lawyer. And there was a very mature company secretary there who actually did everything. He not only ran the board, he looked after the pension scheme, he looked after insurance, he looked after property, he did health and safety, he did all of those things. And that was very much the role of the company secretary in those days. The servant of the board, but the conscience of the company. And two things then happened, certainly in the UK. There was an increase of specialization. So each of those functions that the company secretary used to look after slowly got stripped away. And the second thing happened, that people like me turned up, because there was a growing tide of lawyers going to work in industry. When I went to work in business in 1979, my commercial colleagues in the city thought I was mad. They were quite convinced that I'd had my hand in the till or something like that, and I'd been fired, and I was being put out to pasture in industry, which is where just people went to be forgotten. Life has changed a little since then, and in 2015, I think between 25 and 30% of lawyers practicing in the UK now practice in-house. And the challenge then was for the company secretary was that all these lawyers turning up realized they didn't have access to the boardroom. So the way to get access to the boardroom was to become the company secretary as well. So a number of us actually then wore both hats of in-house lawyer and company secretary. And I think during the 80s and the 90s, as the lawyers moved in and the tasks were taken away, the role became more functional and didn't have the same focus that it had previously. But life has changed. And I think the start of the change really was the introduction in the UK of governance codes, the Cadbury Code in the early 1990s, and the codes that have followed on from there. And it's an interesting reflection, I think, that if you look at what happens in the UK and what happens in the US, the UK is very much a code-driven governance system. You don't find too much governance in the Companies Act or in the law, although there's been more regulation coming in recently. Whereas in the US, it's all driven by legislation. And therefore, the General Counsel very much had the company secretary or the corporate secretary or the board secretary reporting to them. That wasn't so much the case in the UK, as this need for, should we say, independent support, independent of the legal team, started to grow. And the other growth, I think, is the split of the role of chair and CEO. My last chairman at PowerGen, which I left in 2000, 2002, was in fact also the chairman and CEO. So putting the general counsel and company secretary together didn't seem too bad. Nowadays, there are no joint roles in the UK, certainly in the FTSE 100. And once you split those roles, then I think you're in into a mood where you actually can see a very important separate role for the company secretary. The challenge can be, of course, that you get asked, whose team are you on? Are you on the executive team or are you on the board team? And this is something that plays out, and I'll come to a little later. So in what other ways has the role evolved? Well, clearly there are still the basics to do about just running the day-to-day operations of the board. But that's got broader. There are now more board committees being used because the board work has increased. Governance has become an interesting point, not just at board level, but throughout the whole of the group of companies that are sitting there. So subsidiary company governance has become vital and needs to follow the same tone from the top as from the main board. How the board balances their time between strategy and oversight. And corporate reporting has become an industry in its own right, which the company secretary needs to be well on top of. And I can't remember whether it was Nigel or Bob mentioning earlier that a lot of the evolution, certainly in the UK, of regulation around boards and their activities has been very much just additional layers of sticking plaster on top of things rather than a radical rethink. And just keeping up with these different layers of sticking plaster as they go on and the requirements that it places on boards is an industry in itself. The annual general meeting is a matter that is under a lot of review in the UK, particularly through all we've been through in having remote meetings over the last year or so. But in a large company like BP, the AGM was an annual event. It was the chairman's time to be out there, but it's been more involved with engaging with stakeholders as it was with shareholders. And that became an interesting challenge in its own right. So the world is clearly moving, and the boards are going to need to have the right advice and support to address this changing landscape. We use the word governance, and I get sometimes worried about whether governance has become a slightly pejorative word. I'm very pleased that Nigel made the point very early on that governance is an activity in its own right, because I firmly believe that governance is not a higher form of management. Equally, it's not compliance. It's more than compliance. And some of the attitudes of mind, and it goes to what Bob was saying earlier about the grumpy board. I've not in my company, but I've heard say that chairman would say, let's get on with the governance and get that over and done with, and then we can talk about the strategy. No, governance is what boards do. It's the whole task of the board. And so it's not a higher form of management. It's not compliance, it's governance. And that's what the company secretary is basically responsible for, making sure that the board meets all the different requirements that governance in its broadest sense lays at its feet today. So what does the board do? Now, as I said, it governs. And I come from an approach where really the board should only do those things that it can't delegate to management. And when you look at what that is, it's a fairly familiar litany. The board has to do strategy. And this ties in with very much with what Nigel was saying earlier on, that this is all about the long-term vision of the company. Whether it's purpose-driven or however it's driven, it's certainly long-term. And the CEO is really I suppose, the tenant for a short period of time of that vision and of that strategy. Because the board will always be there, but CEOs will change from time to time. And indeed, if you look at the timescale that CEOs are now sitting, maybe 5-6 years, certainly in the UK FTSE 100 companies, a chair who even themselves, who may only be sitting 9 years, could see 3 CEOs during their tenure. And so it's really important that the board looks at strategy and owns strategy over a longer period of time to make sure that the company is driving in the right direction. It's for the CEO to propose the strategy that they're going to adopt to meet that vision, and for the board to endorse it. So that's the first task. The second task, I believe, is to hire, fire, pay, and performance manage the CEO. And that's a task that boards sometimes are not very good at. It's a major point they have to consider. And if you've got a poor performing CEO, sometimes boards will say, I wish we'd have taken action 2 years earlier, because grasping that nettle is so important for the longer term viability and prosperity of the company. And succession, which it gets wound into this, whether it's for the CEO or the executive team, is a vital part of that task. The board needs to understand also what the risk appetite or appetites of the company are. And this is a concept that people wrestle with as to how a company can have a risk appetite, or several of them, and how that actually works. What view of risk does the board take? And in some ways, actually, this goes to delegation, because whilst the board can set the overall tone, it's often the executive who will be taking decisions on projects or investments or other things of that nature. And the way I always approached this with the executive was to say to them, look, you know a lot more about the business than the board do. How can we help the board to see the business through your eyes? And if they can see the business through your eyes and understand the type of risk, how you balance the risks that you're looking at when you're doing a particular activity, then they'll be able to understand that, hopefully, and find out whether the risk appetite that you're setting out is the same as theirs. Because the board needs to understand how risk is governed within the organization. And I use the word, again, governance rather than management, because it's the executive who have got to manage the risk. It's the board who need to understand the overall envelope within which risk is being looked at. And risk isn't simply the risk to the delivery of the strategy. It can be the risk to the company, and it could be just the risk of the unexpected. I do recall going back in time, one of the chairmen saying to a chief executive, well, we talked about the risk to the company, we talked about the strategy, what keeps you awake at night? And he said, well, if you really want to know, it's a particular issue on a particular site, because if something happened there would be a major crisis. And it wasn't even on people's radar screens, but it's having the board having those conversations and getting those understandings so that they can see the whole picture and then make sure that things are properly managed. And this idea of risk is really important, because so much of the tasks or the work of a company is delegated by the board, that they need to be comfortable with what's being done in their name. The next item that the board needs to be looking at is internal control. And clearly internal financial control is important, but the board needs to be able to have the monitoring and oversight to make sure that the controls that they believe are in place are being properly being properly affected and are being properly monitored. And one of the things that came out of the tragedy in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 within BP was that we developed a very different way of looking at risk. Risk had previously been looked at in a very partial way in different parts of the organization. And there was what resulted was one sort of system which came through a year or so later. And it also started people talking about the concepts of gross and net risk. And gross risk was, what's the risk, or what could happen if you're taking a particular activity in a particular place. Gross risk, horrible. What do you do to mitigate that risk? Well, if you put some mitigation in place, then the risk becomes acceptable, or it should be acceptable. But even with the mitigation, is it really acceptable? And the key then is to make sure, from the board's point of view, that those mitigations are actually in place and are happening. Because, to use an example, if you're drilling a well in the Gulf of Mexico and the blowout preventer doesn't work, it's not your blowout preventer, it's a contractor's blowout preventer, but it doesn't work, and someone's not made sure that that doesn't work, then you can have a problem. And it's understanding those sorts of scenarios, making sure the systems are in place, that the board needs to be clear that the tone from the top is working through. And tone from the top is actually one of the, if you like, the last major area the board needs to consider that no one else can really consider. And that is, what's the culture of the organization and how's it going to operate? What does it mean to work here? How do we do things around here? Culture is given many different descriptions, but I use the phrase, how do we do things around here? What's the expectations? And culture and the tone need to be understood by the board and understood throughout the organization. And if people don't operate in accordance with the culture, then there needs to be sanctions, and the board needs to be satisfied that there are sanctions. And this then morphs slightly into the whole concept of reputation. And I think reputation, because of the social media with which we operate now, and the speed with which people rush to judgment, and that the world is very much seen in a good, bad, black or white way, the board needs to be aware of what the perception is of the company outside. Actually, it was quite interesting because BP produced its results yesterday, and the current chief executive was being quizzed about the BP's investment in Russia, which has been there for a considerable time. And was this the right thing to be invested in, because they may have different views of climate change to where the core company had an aspiration. And he was using this as an example. You can't just see it in black and white terms. There's lots of gray in the middle, and that's what business is about. It's sometimes dealing with the gray. But the world of perception and media doesn't tend to work that way, and it can be a little challenging. So that's quite a broad description of the issues, of the things the board can't not do. The board has to do all that. And that's where the company secretary needs to be supporting across all of those areas, obviously working with the executive team. And boards, however, can take on greater responsibilities or greater roles. And this often happens, dependent upon the state of the development of the company. In the early days, if you've got a startup, quite often the board will have more executives than non-executives, because non-executives could well be involved as advisors or consultants, and they're doing more than just a role of independent monitoring, supporting and challenging. But as boards become, or companies become more mature, then the role tends to move more towards oversight and strategy, and the numbers of non-executives increase. I think when I left BP, we had 2 executives and 11 or 12 non-executives. And so that's quite a balance shift than when I was working at PowerGen. I think we had pretty much equal executives and non-executives. There's been a number of reasons for those changes, and we can discuss those down the track, but that's certainly a role. And when you've got that number of non-executives working on a board, then the greater the support that's needed for them. Because all non-executives are information and time poor. They will never have the same levels of information as the executive. And therefore, as the companies become more complex and there are more committees to be serviced, then the non-execs are going to need more support and more assistance in what they're doing. But in all of this, as in all of governance, one size certainly does not fit all. And the way in which the company secretary can try and help through all this and help the board and the committees to add value is through clarity. Clarity on the agendas, clarities on the papers, and the need, I think, to act as a bridge between the executive and the board. And it's vitally important, I think, to ensure also that boards discuss what they want to discuss. And therefore, the company secretary, on behalf of the chairman or with the chairman, needs to be the guardian of the board's initiation rights. And what I mean by that is that the board's ability to initiate conversations, to make sure that the executive don't dominate the agenda, to make sure that if the board has said at a board meeting, well, we'd like a paper on this or a conversation at the next meeting, that actually happens and it's not steered off in another direction. And the whole managing of agendas and making sure that the right things are discussed is a task almost in itself, because clearly there's a normal rhythm of meetings, the quarterly and half-yearly results, the strategy days, the AGM, segment reports, and all the rest of it. But there was one chair I worked with who said, look, David, just leave some white space out there. Leave some white space, because we never know what we're going to want to discuss. And if we've crammed all these agendas with stuff, meritorious though it is, we may not be discussing the real things that the board needs to discuss at the right time. And part of this is then how you facilitate the right discussions. Because as I mentioned, the poverty in terms of time and information, sometimes there can be a frustration in the executives when they bring a paper forward and will say, look, we want to do this, that, and the other. And somehow or other, because there's been a gap between the last board meeting or the board meeting before when the paper was brought, the non-execs seem to be going backwards rather than forwards. And that leads to frustration, because the execs say, well, we've told them that before, don't they understand? And the answer to that is, well, you may say that, but actually they don't remember, because they're not living with it every day. And I know in some organizations, we didn't actually do this well, I did it at PowerGen, but not at BP. And certainly I know you that HSBC used to do it, that no board paper went out that hadn't been reviewed by the company secretary. So that the company secretary was clear on what was in there, what was being asked, and that it was comprehensible to the non-executive directors. And that makes a huge difference if you're trying to aid these things along. I could spend a lot of time talking about the interrelationship with boards and committees, but I think the point I want to make is that boards just don't necessarily meet monthly as a board. There are often other committees. There's a need for the company secretary to look ahead and to anticipate. So the company secretary needs to understand the business, needs to understand its challenges, needs to anticipate, and can help the board add value by what I call directing the traffic. And this is before you act as an unpaid travel agent who has to organize the board and committee visits around the world. So where does the chair come into all of this? I think Nigel said this earlier on, that, and I fully agree, a company has two leaders. The chairman leads the board and the CEO leads the company. And as the role of the board has become broader, so the tasks of the chair have themselves evolved. And let's not forget that no one actually trains a person to be a chairman. The chair can emerge from the existing board, or they can be brought in from outside. And the huge challenge that my last chairman, Carl Henrik, had at BP was that he was Swedish. He had never chaired a UK board before. He came to 2 board meetings. We had an AGM which went well, and 10 days after the AGM, the well in the Gulf of Mexico exploded. And his learning curve was virtually vertical. It was a difficult time, and he came in for some criticism. But he actually was a great chairman, because we worked through all of that. And at the end of his 9 or 10 years, he was seen as actually one of the better chairmen that BP has had. But it's an example that no one trains a chairman. And the lot falls on the company secretary to work with the chair, to help them through, to understand the culture. So the role of the chair is broader, and the expectations are higher. And the board will be also looking to the chair for leadership. And it's not just the way in which the meetings are held, but it's the chair's ability to ensure that the board works well. Part of this is actually knowing the board, and the chair needs to be able to keep in touch with the board to understand where the non-executives are coming from. And part of that was the role I used to play in the boardroom, when I didn't used to say very much, but I would be observing the board meeting all the time. And we'd have a big wash up at the end to understand who was coming from what angle, who might not be happy, who was happy. If people weren't happy, who should the chairman phone? What action should he be taking to keep the board moving forward and not letting people fester if they were unhappy with issues and they hadn't raised them? So it's part of the chair's value task to make sure that the board adds value. And this involves, obviously, his relationship with the CEO. And this lies at the heart of the matter. Sometimes there can be a triangular relationship between the chairman, the CEO, and the company secretary. But woe betide any company secretary who gets in between the chairman and the CEO, because there's only one loser in that, and that's the company secretary. The important thing is that the contacts take place, conversations take place, and that the right things are discussed. And in many ways, chairs themselves may not be full-time. They have other roles. They may not be located in the country where the board is located. They travel. But the business of the company will go on 24/7. So this is where the concept of the chairman's office comes in, because it's a sort of company secretary's office plus. It's permanent support for the company, for the chairman and the board all the time. And it starts with the idea that the company secretary should report directly to the chair and should be responsible for his budget. The company secretary needs to be able to work with the chair's PA and understand the chair's schedule for that company and liaise with any other companies where the chair is also chair or on the board. It's a coordination role. The chairs of companies are now a lot more visible than they used to be. So thought needs to be given not only to the board and committee business, but to the company business that the chair needs to be involved in. So what's his role both internally and externally? If there's internal work, where should he be visiting? What should he be saying? What briefing does he need? Who's going to be there? Does the CEO even know he's traveling? And how does that relationship work so that what the chair's doing inside the company is to the benefit of the board and adds value? But secondly, externally, who speaks for the company? And quite often this can be a rather tense issue. but it needs to be sorted out, particularly if there's a crisis. So there need to be grown-up conversations facilitated as necessary by the company secretary to make sure that the chair and the CEO have understand each other and know who's saying what. And quite often they can be speaking to shareholders, and certainly in the UK, different conversations take place between the chair and the executive with the same shareholders at different times about different issues. With the CEO and the finance director, the shareholders will be interested in financial performance, whereas with the chair, they'll be interested in strategy, the performance of the CEO, and the general direction of the company. And they are very different sort of discussions. So there needs to be good support for that. In many companies, this support simply comes from the executive. And that does work, it can work, but it's what visibility should the chairman have? Because if there is a problem, if there is an issue, what credibility does the chair have to go out and speak for the company? Because the company may be completely identified with the CEO. And then when the cry goes up, where was the board? And the chair needs to be speaking. Does the chair have both the credibility externally and the confidence internally to go and do this? And that was an interesting challenge we faced in the early days of the Gulf of Mexico. And it's important that the chair doesn't become a sort of poor relation in that in that relationship and is not remembered when communication's needed. There's also other coordination because the chair may be on other boards. The chair may be wanting to give press interviews as a result of the other relationships. So all of these things fall within the ambit of the chairman's office to make sure these things are thought about and the chair is supported and matters are taken forward. So it's a matter of having the right dedicated resources at the right level. So there is a need, I believe, for this office. It works well, but, and I think there's a but here, that whilst the argument is clear, there may be arguments on a cost basis of why do we need to set this up as a separate organization. And also, one needs to be careful about behaviors, personalities, and preferences, because this is all about relationships and people. But that's, I think, true of all governance, that you can write as many codes as you like and adopt processes, but if the behaviors aren't right, then they won't work. I was fortunate that I worked with two chairmen where they wanted that role, they wanted that support. And in a company the size of BP, it was important that they had a voice there when they weren't there to make sure that they were properly represented. The challenge, though, if you're trying to run that role, as if you're running the chairman's office, is that as the company secretary, you mustn't forget the rest of the board. Because it's quite possible that if you're running the chairman's office and you're doing everything for him, or her rather, the board could say, well, what about us? Who's looking after us? Have you become solely identified with the chair? And that can be dangerous in its own right, because it's the board that adds value, not just the chair. So it's really important that one is aware of all those things. Within the UK, we obviously have a senior independent director or lead director. They need to be worked with. And also there's the chairs of each of the committees. So it's quite a web of contacts that the company secretary running the chairman's office needs to be aware of and sensitive to as one goes forward. The bottom line, though, is that you can only do this if the company secretary has the chair's confidence, because your license to operate, if you like, inside the company is only good if you basically carry a certain amount of ostensible authority from the chairman. But it's important, though, that the chairman wants to have someone who's his or her eyes and ears into the business. So it can be quite a delicate balance. The conclusion, I think, from all of this is that we've seen that the role of the company secretary has evolved back into a more central role within the company, that there are very clear tasks that only the company secretary can do, and that boards do need this support to work in this ever-changing world. And the larger the company and the higher profile the company, the need, I think, for completely discreet support for the chairman from an office in the way I've described. What does that mean for the company secretary? Well, not only do you have to be a professional and great on company law and governance, but you need to be a good listener. You need to be a clear and concise communicator. You need to be discreet with the ability to hold secrets, sometimes from different people at different times. Sometimes my role was described as a bit like being the parish priest. You need to be diplomatic. You need to be tactful. You need to be self-aware. You need to know when not to say anything. And at the end of the day, you need to be willing to speak truth to power. So again, no pressure. But as a role, it can be incredible fun and very rewarding. But as I've said, it does depend on the chair wanting to have that level of support and seeing it as a very real role. And if the chair doesn't, well, the challenge for the company secretary is all these things have to be delivered somehow. And regrettably, the company secretary is going to have to find another way of delivering this, because if it's not delivered, then it's probably unlikely that the board will be able to really add the value of which it's capable. Thank you very much indeed.
David, many thanks. Terrific. That was a masterly mapping of both the territory and the issues. Now we have two responders, Ronaele Daythorne-Bayrd from Barbados, and Alison Dillon Kibilige, as she said earlier, now in Uganda. So I'm going to ask Ronaele and Alison if they could keep their comments down to about 5 minutes, please, and then we'll open it up for everybody to join in. I'll ask Ronaele to go first, please.
Thank you, Professor Garratt. David, thank you very, very much for that contribution. You so capably summed up the real crux of the matter, I think, for all of us, that it was incredibly insightful. And knowing the type of organization that you not only survived in, but thrived in and contributed to the success of is so impressive, and I thank you for that. I think we all agree in terms of what both Nigel and David have highlighted vis-a-vis the role of the board and the fact that the board needs to serve as stewards of the company, that their role is not that of management and not that of driving the day-to-day, but instead of serving as the stewards of an organization and in making sure that there's the right level of oversight and driving the overall strategy in the right direction. So I won't get into that. I fully agree with David's comments on all of those very important points in terms of the board's role. In terms of the role of the company secretary, you know, your summary, David, is what I think hit home for me in a very meaningful way. The fact that the company secretary's effectiveness really is impacted by the chair's confidence in that individual in that role. Without that relationship and the right level of interaction, and respect for and understanding of the contribution to be made and the chairman's need to understand what those capabilities are and how they can add value to his or her success and to the overall success of the board as a whole, really summarize the crux of the matter. And those skills that you highlighted as well, being a good listener, being discreet, being self-aware, are all vitally important to the success of a company secretary. So going back as well to your points on the evolutionary stage of a company and the size of the company, helping to determine what the role of the company secretary needs to be, and is there benefit in having a full-fledged, separate, independent office? There's a range of approaches you can take to having a company secretary role filled. Is this one individual versus all the way to a full independent office to support the chairman? Will always depend on the level of the need of the chairman and the board and what the resources are that are available. But regardless of what level that company secretary falls at, there are key things that the role needs to focus on, in my view. You've highlighted most of them, many of them. But one of the comments you made that jumped out at me is the need to be the guardian of the board's initiation rights. And that to me was key, because it speaks to the company secretary's very fundamental role in helping the chairman to manage those relationships, not only between the executive function and the board, but among the directors as well. The dynamics within a boardroom are like no other. It's a compilation of personalities, goals, everyone with varied opinions, backgrounds, skill sets, and making that body function as a cohesive, fine-tuned machine that is able to serve the company to the best of its ability is really the ultimate goal. And the role of the company secretary, be it as an individual or as a full-fledged company secretary, chairman's office, really is key. And having the right relationship between the chairman and the individual, or the chairman and that overall office, is going to have a key impact on the success of the board, managing those personalities and managing those relationships. So that guardian of the board's initiation rights and the role of the secretary in making sure that each and every director, whether executive or non-executive, feels empowered to ask for the information that they need and to ask the questions and to push back when necessary. That to me is a key takeaway from your comments this morning. So Bob, I don't know if I'm at 5 minutes yet, but I don't want to run the risk of going over those. That's just my initial feedback to David's presentation.
Okay, well, many thanks, Ronaele. You're, of course, very welcome to join in the conversation as it develops, in which case, shall I move on to Alison then, please? And we'll hear from her, and then we'll have an open conversation. Thank you, Ronaele, very much indeed.
Thank you very much, and thank you, David. You brought back many memories, and I felt a bit like deja vu, obviously, of when I was board secretary in Barclays and Unilever. Many of the same challenges that you were addressing, I think I certainly felt a familiarity with. And I agree with you that the EQ and SQ, if you like, skills of a company secretary are as important, if often not more important, than the technical skills that we have. I liked as well the focus you put on the independence and in a way the impartiality of the role of the company secretary, because I think to be able to carry out the role, they are very important qualities, and they're not as easy as it often sounds to actually remain independent or impartial sometimes. I'd also like to add, because I know you spent some time talking about the board, and I think one of the challenges that company secretaries are going to have moving forward are how do we actually help boards, help chairs move into this transition that Professor Garratt was talking about at the beginning into this ESG or EESG. And it's one area I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been discussing across the globe almost with whether they're corporate company or board secretaries. Things, for instance, like, you know, how are we going to redefine how we assess whether or not a proposal is going to be a success? I mean, obviously, traditionally, we've done that financially. Things have been monetized. How are we going to move on to incorporating some of the what are called intangible assets into you know, the calculation of whether we can see something being successful in the long term? Secondly, what kind of structural changes are we going to need to see in organizations? Organizations today are set up really to produce financial information up to the board. But if we're going to have this more integrated thinking, you know, we're going to have to see organizational structures change, I believe. How? This is the question. So that the non-financial information comes up through the organization in a balanced way with financial. And I always wonder whether or not the position of the CFO or finance director is actually going to lessen somewhat as this change takes place. And you're going to see other positions in the senior management team maybe coming into, whether it's the C-suite or into more focus. Also at the board level, and I know some of this has happened at BP, looking at the kind of traditional board committees of your audit committee and your remuneration committee, which really, again, are very investor focused. What kind of non-investor, but other kind of stakeholder committees maybe should boards be looking at? And are we going to see boards having a choice? Are they going to, you know, have to have an audit committee and a remuneration committee? Or will they be able to choose which committees suit them better? Whether it's, I believe at BP, do you have is it Environmental Health and Safety Committee? I know when I was at Unilever, we had a CSR and Reputation Committee, and many other organizations are picking up those kinds of committees. You talked about culture. And again, as we've seen, and this has come out in many of the scandals that we've seen, where cultures have been pushed through remuneration that has been very financially based. How are we going to see, and again, I know Unilever spent a lot of time on this, how do you build values, ethics, stakeholder kind of mentality into the culture of the organization and into how you reward people, into their performance indicators, both at a corporate and a personal level. Also, and I heard the CEO of Unilever talking about this reframing of an acceptance of failure. So that obviously when you're looking at financial targets, there's an expectation that you're going to meet them. Whereas with some of the non-financial targets, you can get, what's the word I'm looking for? You can be recognized for getting part of the way to the target because you are improving the environment or improving the social elements to what you're doing. And so this requirement not always to meet that target 100%, which I think some board members might struggle with, particularly those that are used to having to hit those targets. And then finally, how do you report on all of this? Professor Garratt again mentioned, you know, corporate reporting, and I think you mentioned, David, corporate reporting. You know, Financially, we've all got international financial reporting standards. And again, as COSECs, we had to struggle with learning that and learning how we interpreted and help the board to interpret it. But where do we go with the non-financial? Because at the moment, there's a plethora of different standards. I know they're coming together, but what advice can we give and how can we help assist the chairman in how we report on potentially the good works that we're doing within the organisation? So that was kind of my contribution to the conversation. And as I said, thank you very, very much for your presentation. I think you summed up what it means to be a company, corporate or board secretary very well. Thank you very much, David. Thank you. And Ronaele, thank you.
Alison, many thanks. Let me come back to David. David, are you happy if I open it up to questions now, or would you like to respond to anything that Ronaele or Alison has just said? My gut reaction is to go for opening it up now, but
I'm happy we open it up. I think
okay,
and certainly if during the questions I can weave in some thoughts that Alison's raised, I think that might be the most effective way, because let's hear what others have to say. But I thank both Ronaele and Alison for their comments, and certainly some of the things that Alison was saying about reporting and the challenges now of looking through different eyes other than financial, I think is something that we could well discuss. But okay, let's open it up.
That's great. Then what I'm going to do is say, Kamla, can you be in charge of bringing people in who want to ask questions, please?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry about that. I had unmuted to make sure that the dogs were quiet enough during that time. Yes, I've just sent a message on the chat for persons to know that they can raise their hands virtually. We will see, or also they could make their comments, and yes, we'd be able to include them in the conversation.
Kamla, this is Lara. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you, Lara.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand virtually. I'm not, I can't find the button. So if I can.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I have a question in terms of how one treats with or deals with politically appointed directors. So I have served on a couple of boards where some of us were independent, impartial, objective, and others were there to serve a particular political agenda. And of course, very often this led to quite a bit of conflict, or certainly things just not moving forward. So I wonder if you had any advice, and we live in a very small country where you also very often get the same people being recycled into directorship. So you move from board to board and there'll be the same individuals time and time again. So really a question on how does one manage, either as a chairman or even another board member, politically appointed directors who come there with a specific agenda, and also the fact that we do suffer, I think, from a lack of new ideas, new talent in a number of our boards. We do tend to recycle the same old. So just a couple questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question, Lara. I think a very, very important one for us to consider first in the region. But I will refer your question to David, if he may have a response. Also Ronaele, because she works in the region and has done some research in Barbados in particular, whether there's anything specific to state directors. And if it's okay, Camille Facey is on. Yes, she is. Camille, I think you have some excellent views on what Jamaica has been doing in terms of managing that whole process with directors on state boards. And I think Lara's point in terms of those who come with a political agenda, how do we deal with it? So first, can I ask David if he wants to give the first response, then if there's anything Ronaele wants to add, and I'm going to ask Camille then if she will join us too.
Well, thank you. I must say this, you've actually touched on a topic which I have very little experience of, I'm afraid. The only experience I had of it actually was when we were privatizing the electricity industry in the UK, and we actually brought we had to have a representative from HM government on the board then, but they were, because they were so keen that we privatized the company, we had very little difficulty with them. They were quite passive. So I think I'm going to bow to the superior knowledge of colleagues in the region, because I'm not sure there's anything I can really add, I'm afraid.
Yes. Okay, Ronaele?
My comments would be, would take us back to the skill set and the role of the chair and the level of support he has from a strong company secretary. You may have instances of folks with their own agenda, be it political or otherwise. Every director, you run the risk of there being biases, of there being individual personal agendas or political agendas. And in my experience, it will always come down to the ability of the chair to manage those personalities, to demonstrate a level of empathy with strength and clear understanding as to what the ultimate goals are of the organization, insisting on that being on the fore of every discussion, regardless of those individual agendas, and not taking it lightly. There will be some that will be more difficult than others, but those conversations need to be had. And it will always come down, in my mind, to the ability of the chairman to navigate those challenging situations. And from a Caribbean perspective, a part of the chair's ability to do that is going to be our evolution in our chairs becoming more astute and more open to and more receptive of the support of strong company secretaries. That's something I hope we have the opportunity to discuss a bit more. It doesn't speak directly to Lara's question, but our chair's ability to really benefit from the support of a strong company secretary. We have a long way to go there. We're still very much in most of our organizations at the stage of chairs wanting an administrative function. And when we're able to move past that, they will truly benefit from having the support of a strong company secretary. But to speak directly to the question that was posed, it really is going to depend largely on the skill sets of the chair.
Yes, and Kamala, if I may join the conversation.
Absolutely.
So I agree with Ronaele about the chairman, but in Jamaica, we have done some things. We have, and she alluded to this, developed a board competency profile. So whereas the political directorate may still appoint friends and persons who are politically connected, these persons have to have the specific competencies that are needed on the board. Going through Parliament as we speak is our selection and nomination policy. Regulations, we have a policy which is now being turned into regulations. And these regulations will prohibit government from appointing members of parliament, senators, and certain councillors to boards. So what we're doing is ensuring that the persons who go on boards are not just persons there who are just completely politically motivated. They must be competent and they cannot hold certain positions in government. Or there's also, there are also regulations regarding how the chairman should be selected and appointed. So I think these things go a long way in trying to deal with the political aspect. But if I may also comment on the presentations, having been a corporate secretary for 20 plus years for publicly traded companies, corporate secretary and general counsel, I think David's presentation was absolutely brilliant. I really appreciate it. I think brilliant. That's all I have to say. I would add to the conversation that very often the corporate secretary survives both the chair and the CEO. I have been in situations where the CEO is about to be asked to leave and she doesn't know, but I know. So that bridge and the fact that you have to very often be the institutional memory, and you have to bring that to the board and to your new chairman. Those are things that I would just add to the little mix. But thank you so much. You were absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Camille.
Thank you very much, Camille. So to answer Lara, I am I suppose I'm in the position where I can, because I chair one state, one semi-state. And I have been fortunate in that I haven't had openly political representation on the board. But the point I make very clearly is, one, the distinction between management and the board, that we are here to direct and to guide, not to get involved in the day-to-day. And two, that we are focused on the purpose of the company and ensuring that we are serving that purpose. And for me, that is critical. And then you have to ensure that in the conversation, the rest of the board, or the majority of the board, appreciates the importance of the purpose that we are there to serve. So for me, that's the way to manage that kind of risk, if you will. So.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And if I may add one more comment too, because Lara spoke about the fact that you have the same persons revolving, and where do we generate the new ideas, and so I am hopeful that these types of seminars that we have at CCGI is going to really help persons to push their boundaries and help mentor and bring a new generation of persons as well, who are going to tackle a lot of these problems that we have been facing with for a long time. And just before we leave this point, I wanted to add with Jamaica, Camille, I was learning just recently that, in fact, and just clarify first, is it legislation or is it policy in Jamaica that when boards change, at least a percentage, I think a 1/3 percentage, must remain for institutional memory purposes, so that you have that continuity?
Policy about to become legislation.
Okay.
There's been a lot of pushback, but we have pushed back as well. And what we're also legislated is, I'm not sure if that's legislation or just policy, is youth. So part of that board profile has a gender mix, 30% either way, as well as youth. And youth is described as being under 30. So that is where too you're going to get the new generation coming in. And the new ideas, those who are tech savvy, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I see Lara's comment that CCGI can identify specific individuals for mentoring and training to become directors. Yes, all that is in the future, the things that we can do, and we look forward to having a lot of our very experienced directors guiding us in this process and helping in that identification process. Also, for instance, one of the things that Camille and they had presented to us here at CCGI before was the idea of a database of directors who are trained in governance, which I think is really needed, so that no matter which side of the political divide you are on, or not political even, you come with a certain amount of understanding as to what is the role and function of the board. But I really like, Camille, the point you made about the role of the corporate secretary being the one that lives on, past the board and past the CEO. And therefore, the real crucial importance in growing our corporate secretaries, so that they themselves have that skill set to bridge that divide of the various boards and the various management teams to help keep the organization focused. I mean, it wasn't an area that I thought of before, but certainly it's one of the areas we can focus on in terms of the growth of the corporate secretary, to ensure that they understand that fundamental role that they may play from time to time. Yes. Okay. Okay, I was looking at a comment, but it's Indu saying that she needs to leave now. That's okay. We quite appreciate having had you participate, Indu, and we look forward to you being able to give us other contributions as we move forward. One of the things...
Sorry, Kamala, before you move on, could I just make one point? Because I think as company secretaries, we need to be very careful when we have these directors who are sitting on our boards, particularly if they're representing governments, on 2 points. One is how we actually draft the minutes of the conversations that have been and the discussions that have been had at the board. Because I've had situations where the agenda has not been a hidden agenda, but has been very, very obvious, even to the extent where you could almost argue, for those of us that have the concept of shadow directors, that the particular government or governments, as I've worked on one that had 2 governments represented, they were pushing their own agenda so hard that potentially, because it was a separate company, you could have had challenges with shadow directors. And I found myself having conversations with the particular directors, trying to explain to them in a very diplomatic way what their responsibilities were on the board, but also the fact that they needed to watch their own phrasing as to how they said things, so that they didn't make the governments they were representing become potentially shadow directors, which I knew, having spoken to the government ministers involved that they were there representing, they didn't want to happen. So I think how we draft the minutes, reflecting some of these conversations and advising the chair to allow them to have time to put forward the points of view that they need to put forward, but again then advising the board directors possibly out of the meeting their phraseology, so that when the minutes come out you don't create problems for yourself in the future. So I think for company secretaries who are struggling with this, it's something to really think about.
Can I ask a question, Kamala?
Sure, no.
Alison, so those boards where you clearly took the initiative and used your own skill sets and your interpersonal skills to have very tactful discussions with those directors, I'm curious to know, where did your chair fall in that equation? Did the chairs in both instances also take the initiative to make sure the right tone was being set and those conversations were being had the way Nigel has indicated he handles his own 2 boards?
The situation we had was that it's a not-for-profit where 2 governments were represented. So we had a member of Ministry of Finance, and then we had an ambassador from an embassy who was actually the investor. And I think that the chair was caught between both of them, which is why the chair actually said to me, is there any way you can help? Because I feel I can't, I can't talk to either of these 2 people, because she'd been appointed by both of them. And I think she felt she was trying to create a balance. She had her own position of trying to create the balance between the 2. So, so yes, I worked together with the chair, and I kind of didn't go off just on my own and do something politically on my own.
Right. Gotcha.
I did have the chair's support, but she didn't actually feel she could do it herself. So that's why she asked me to get involved.
Right. I've seen Camille has just made a comment that actually I was about to touch on as well, Camille, that both induction and ongoing board assessments have the ability to help to reinforce the same things Nigel was speaking about, and to drive that discussion among all directors, be it executive, non-executive, politically appointed. You have the opportunity, both as part of the induction process and as part of any ongoing board assessments, to reinforce those very important points. I've done some work in the region with boards in terms of assessments, and done those independently, independent of the company secretary and the chair. And that gives the opportunity as part of the overall process to reinforce individual directors as part of the discussion, the same things that we're touching on. So I think to Lara's point, there are different stages at which you can try to manage that process and drive the right behaviors.
Kamala, you have 3 hands up.
I do actually. I'm not seeing.
Liz Cox, Daniel Milan, and Peter Crow.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, then, if the gentlemen don't mind, we'll go with ladies first and ask Liz if she would make her contribution or ask a question.
Thanks, Kamala. I think you spoiled me too much. Thank you, guys. All right. I wouldn't add to all the nice flurry words that was said on the presentation, because I think it was really excellent, on point, and all of that. I was making copious notes because as a chair, I too have to be aware of my role as a chair. But Lara mentioned the government sector, and Kamala, you know my views on the government sector and my experiences, good and bad, in the government sector. But I really wanted to ask a question on private companies, because again, I have been involved in quite a few private companies. A lot of private companies are required sometimes by statute to have boards, and so they pull in friends and colleagues and sometimes experts. And I mean, I've found myself at least in 2 occasions where it's a family-owned company, and it's so difficult. It's very, very difficult. I get to get them to adhere to or even adapt corporate governance. So, how is the best way, apart from just walking away, of course? Well, how is the best way you think that we can and I can get through this? Because it's twice it has happened. They have no interest in corporate governance. They form a committee, you come up with ideas. And then, it's just like, no, we're not ready for that yet. We're not big enough for that yet. So, I mean, it has always been my take to, if I'm going to be part of anything, it has to have some structure. It has to be going in the right direction. And, I get really frustrated when I see basic things that I think, and I think this is, having corporate governance is very basic, that it's kind of like not pushed to the side. It is just listened with scantily, not even addressed in any way. So I don't know if there's any tips that David can share, or even my favorite Professor Garratt can share. And how do I get through to these people that this is very important? This will add value to their organization. And certainly, I think at the end, increase their profit margins. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think the whole idea of the private company and the family company is a very real challenge, and I think it's one of the issues I think you find around the world, that because quoted companies are that much more visible because of their reporting relationships and relations with investors, that a lot of the attention goes there. But certainly the way I look at this is that certainly in the UK, the duties of directors are exactly the same whether you're in a private company or in a quoted company. Your requirements to report now about how you're carrying out those duties aren't any different. And I suppose I approach it from the point of view of what potential liabilities people could be having if they fail to carry out their duties. Now, I don't know in different jurisdictions, how the duties play out, what the ability of the courts is to intervene. But certainly I would have thought that basic good corporate governance and corporate governance procedures would set the company in good stead. If ever what it's doing is called into question. And I suppose I'd approach it from that point of view. Now, whether that's an unduly legalistic way of looking at it, I don't know. Bob, do you come at it from a different angle?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it from the angle as they do have these committees, they've set up these committees. I actually chaired one of the committees and did a lot of work in presenting what I thought is something that they should look at for the future of the company, particularly things like succession planning. I looked at the conflict of interest between the shareholders and the CEO. And it was looked at the board meeting, but it was fiercely put down by the major shareholder that this is not something that we want to pursue. And this is not something that we are going to pursue, even though I said, check the act. There is legislation that forces you to put yourself in order. But it was just not accepted. And I came off the board. Because I'm like, I'm not going to subject myself to any kind of liability risk here. And I think there will be a liability risk. But what has happened, David, is that the other directors are saying, wait a minute, why did Liz leave?
Yeah.
Why is Liz walking away? So everybody is now, is like alert now. Okay, why Liz? I mean, with all that passion and all that you bring to the board, why is Liz walking away? So, I mean, I had a private conversation with one of them that I'm kind of close with, and I told him, I said, let me be honest, I really will not subject myself to liability risk, and I'm not going to do that. It is not within me to do that.
Well, and that may be the thing you have to do if to make the point, and then they understand it. But it is very difficult if you've got one large shareholder who can control the board, the company, and everything else, to make them want to change unless there is another institutional or other pressure on them, I'd have thought.
All right, great. Thanks.
Daniel's hand. Oh, Peter first,
Peter,
and then that.
yes, Peter first. Sorry.
You're on mute, Peter. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I've got my finger on the space button now, because then when I finish talking, I'll let it go. I thank you very much, David. It was fantastic, and my comment has been usurped a little by your response then, David, and it's very helpful. But I'd like to perhaps reinforce and then extend your comment. The issue that I was going to raise was that of the conversation to date had been very much focused on listed companies. And most of my work is with privately held, family, etc. But the legislation around the world, as far as I understand, across 4 continents that I work, is largely the same. There is no distinction in relation to that ownership structure. What I tend to do, by way of a comment, if I may, is focus the privately held and family firms, if it is possible, much more on strategy and purpose. That in many jurisdictions, a company secretary is not a legal presence requirement. That some staff member or some invited other party takes minutes, for example. And so the role that the external directors, non-family, non-shareholding directors can provide is that of some additional knowledge and insight around the direction and the purpose and the focus of the company, so that the reporting is beyond those financial elements and those compliance elements that are more important. They are still required, but it's to move beyond that. The other comment I would make is to Camille's point. I try and do due diligence on the way in. Sometimes you can do it, but if you discover that the appetite for the matters that Camille's commented on is not there, my recommendation, and in fact I've done it personally, is to leave the board. Otherwise you become, quite frankly, disabled. And I know that's a reasonably direct and blunt instrument, but as directors, and many of us have got 20 and 30 years experience in a range of boards, we do need to not only protect ourselves, but it plays to our personal ethics and morals. So I just wanted to add those comments. Thank you very much, David. And
Daniel?
Thank you very much. And let me add my voice of thanks to David as well for a wonderful presentation. I don't have any experience working with company secretaries, so this is coming sort of from a position of ignorance. But it struck me while you were talking, and then seemed, and I suppose it's a fairly obvious point to make, is that the things you explained in terms of the position of the secretary becomes easier the better the governance structures and the higher the levels of governance are in the organization, and then it becomes a virtuous cycle where as the company secretary you can make those contributions. But my question is, what happens when you have an accidental board or a grumpily compliant board? I can well imagine that the CEO in those contexts would approach the company secretary and almost claim them and say, you belong to me, I expect loyalty to me, not to the directors. And there might be, in some cases, if there is poor governance, it's likely that those independent directors do not have the necessary skills to really fulfill their fiduciary duty. So what advice can you give to a company secretary who is in that position where there's sort of undue influence and expectations from the CEO?
I think the way I would approach this is that you have the CEO, you have the chairman. I think unless the board is a complete sort of group of people who are completely in awe of the CEO, there will always be someone who you can go to, normally a senior independent director or a chair of one of the committees, and have these sort of conversations. Because I think it goes to what Peter just said. If even in a quoted company, if people are in awe of the chief executive or somebody else, what are their own personal ethics for being on that board in the first place and being complicit in what that board is doing? So I think that the role is in a very tactful way to talk to the directors about whether they're happy about things, how things are operating, and frankly, if necessary, it's they who should be going to the chair rather than the company secretary to say, look, we're just not happy the way as we directors are going on, things are happening. So you don't necessarily to be upfront in it, but you perhaps can also be, I suppose, behind the scenes, just talking to the directors about how they feel things are. That's the way I would approach it, I must say, because I think it's more difficult now to have what we used to call the imperial CEO than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But equally, there is always that risk. But normally the split between a chair and a CEO would put attention into that relationship. And I think also that just the sheer expectations now of what's on boards and the deal to deal with reputation and other things will put greater pressures on. So I hope that those boards are not the same. But you look and see, how the financial crisis with RBS happened. A lot of very well-known people sat on a board where Fred Goodwin was the CEO. What pushback was there then? Would there be pushback now? We've had a recent thing in the UK about Carillion. That went bust. There were some quite well-known people on that board. Did they push back? I don't know. I mean, this is where I suppose you end up with, I think your question is, how do you move away from groupthink, which is supporting the CEO? And I think somehow or other there has to be a catalyst to say people, this isn't right. And it comes back to my point about someone needs to speak truth to power.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I may ask, I saw Jacqueline saying that she's about to leave, but she had a really great contribution that she was making on the chat. Are you still here, Jacqueline?
Mm-mm.
Okay, no, I think I missed her. All right, well, let's just share it quickly, and we can continue conversation. So from Jacqueline Commoner, she said, great session, David. I'm afraid I must leave the session. I just want to make a point. The role of the corporate secretary requires great diplomacy, particularly balancing the relationships between the CEO and management and the chairman. I have also seen over the last decade legal liability and responsibility shift from the CEO and management to the board. It's a very important point. This is an important shift which requires the corporate secretary to ensure the chairman and board are provided with the necessary information and reports. It can be a very lonely position. Thank you. Yes, David.
Oops. I think a lot of these positions can be lonely, to be quite honest. The ultimate liability always lies with the directors at the end of the day, and I think this is where clarity and oversight and understanding what the executive is doing on the board's behalf is absolutely key. And I think it's I don't know, there's no perfect answer to this, because it is about people, it is about how these relationships work. But I think what is really important is it comes back to this point about what does it mean to be a director? How are people trained? Do they understand their liabilities? Because if they do understand their liabilities, and their liabilities are not just legal liabilities, they can often be reputational. Because certainly one of the features that I've seen is that this rush to judgment, that every incident is suddenly a crisis and every crisis is a scandal. And as directors of a board, you can be found guilty in the court of public opinion a lot quicker than you can be found guilty in the law courts. And I think that's an additional issue that directors need to really think about when they take on particular roles and they go on boards. It's part of the due diligence they should be doing to understand what they're taking on and what they're getting themselves into.
Okay, great. I see a contribution from Alison on the chat. Alison, can we ask you to share it on mic?
Yes, I was just really saying, and I'm sure David has been in this position as well. I think this is where your EQ and SQ skills as a company secretary really come to the fore. And I've found in the organisations, whether they've been big listed companies or smaller companies, building strong relationships with both the chairman and the CEO. But trying to remain impartial so that they get to respect your impartiality. Now, you're then able, hopefully, to persuade them and get them to stand in the other person's shoes and all of these kind of skills that you learn. I've jokingly put there, if all else fails, you need to persuade the CEO that it's their idea if you want them to do something different. And I've worked with CEOs that jokingly have said, as I was leaving, the one thing I suddenly realized about Alison was that many times she said no to me, but I didn't realize because she'd persuaded me it was actually my own idea. And I think that's, one of the great skills as co-secs we can try and develop. How can we use what I know now is called smart power, where you actually convince people it's their idea to do something. I think it's a good skill to develop.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask on a point that David made in his presentation, how often corporate secretaries encounter this issue where you have directors on your board who actually are directors on other boards as well. And so sometimes they may be more interested in their agenda as a director for another company while they are serving on yours. And how often do we have corporate secretaries then having to really help the chairman make sure that the focus is on that specific board that they are on? Because we have in the region quite a few directors who serve on multiple boards. And this is actually coming back to the earlier question that Lara asked in terms of when you have the same people revolving, and sometimes they will then have their own agenda with what they would want to achieve.
I think the interesting challenge there is that this is actually much, certainly in the UK, very much in the focus of the investors and indeed the regulators, because what's seen as overboarding is now very much dealt with through the governance codes. And I'm slightly out of not as up to speed as I would be on the codes at the moment, but my recollection was there's almost certainly an implicit point system, and certainly in some of the continental European countries there's an express point system that if you go over sort of 6 points or 5 points, then you should be voted against at an annual general meeting. And I think there was 2 points for being a chair and 1 point for being on a board. So you could rack up those quite quickly, and that certainly wants to stop the serial non-executive director. And I think part of this as well, actually, there's all these apocryphal stories of directors turning up in the boardroom, and you can hear the snap of the elastic band as they take the elastic band of the papers when the board meeting starts. And my experience, maybe I've just been playing at a level where people take these things very seriously, but normally there's peer pressure from directors on their colleagues, that if people don't think they're pulling their weight, then they're not backwards in coming forwards to the chairman to say, look, I think you need to be managing this situation and dealing with it. And I think, but I do respect this, because I think the time that directors have to spend as non-executive directors has gone through the roof. And it's not it's not right just to think about it. Some of our directors used to not say, how many days am I supposed to do? It's almost a case of, on how many days do I have to think seriously about BP? And as soon as you start looking at it that way, it can be on your mind an awful lot. And as I said, with the spread of committees, and Alison raised the question of what committees does one have? Certainly, one of the most active committees that BP still has is the Safety, Ethics and Environmental Assurance Committee. And that's been operating for a number of years. So you've got an audit committee, you've got the SEAC, you've got the nominations committee. And we would start using committees to manage crises. So when we had the incident in the Gulf of Mexico, we immediately set up a committee called the Gulf of Mexico Committee. And that committee was there originally to have oversight over the money that was being spent to clean up the Gulf. And it morphed into being a legal committee to look at all the claims and the interactions that went on. That committee sat for 6 years, almost on a monthly basis. And when we were repositioning ourselves in Russia, we actually set up a Russia committee. And the reason we did all this was to keep the board agenda clear to run the business and to look at the strategy. But the amount of commitment that meant from the non-executive directors was substantial. And I think one of our non-executive directors once joked that actually, if he was paid on an hourly basis, he'd be earning less than the living wage. So it's a slightly trite thing to say, but actually the amount of time that was spent is immense. And I think, okay, that was when there was a crisis, but even in solid state, in steady state, the expectations now of committee meetings, of visits to facilities and all these things, you can't do more than 2 boards, 3 boards, maybe, and you certainly can't chair more than 2 boards, I would have thought.
The comment that you've just made, David, is reinforced with the Australian Stock Exchange listing code, where the maximum is 4 and a chairman counts 2. So if you've got 2 chairmanships, that's it. And that's on the basis of 1 week per board per month effort. because remembering, and it's implied in your comments, but not explicitly stated. So if I could be so bold as to add, you're a director 24/7, and as such, you should know that when you sign up, and if the going is calm and steady, it's fantastic. But sometimes things blow up, don't they? and you've got to be prepared. I've just I chair a board, and the board that I'm one of the boards that I'm on and chair, the senior manager who's responsible for the entire corporate service function has just announced he has cancer. That was his Christmas present. And it's a family business, and it's a significant business, and we've got a lot going on at the moment. I've been on site 3 times in the last 3 weeks, and that's not me. That's just the function of, and we need to be prepared to do that. So well done for calling it.
But also it's the other side of it. I mean, I'm not involved in full-time employment anymore, so you take up certain retirement activities, and all I'd say is if you have a pandemic, don't be involved in hospitality, education, or the arts.
Or in New Zealand tourism. A full-time, you make a good point, full-time executive roles and directorships concurrently, it seems to be sought after around the world. Do you have a comment on the viability of that longer term, David or Bob?
Just going to go quickly first. I think that's a very interesting challenge because I was hearing what was being said earlier to suggest that there was an idea to get people under 30 to come on boards and do things like that to get the next generation through. And I think there should be greater efforts made to get a greater diversity of ages and experience on boards. The challenge I think we face in the quoted area back in the UK is the governance checklist, which is when the shareholders look and see what board attendance people have had. If people haven't done, if they drop below, I don't know, 80% of attendance, then suddenly that's a black mark and directors can get voted against. But that said, I remember talking to a chair, you know, when Tony Hayward was CEO of BP, and this guy said, look, I know Tony can't turn up to every board, but if he can turn up to, you know, 4 out of the 8 board meetings, and one of them's the strategy meeting, and he can come and spend some time with us, that's fine. I'd just like to get his experience because he's running a business at the moment. And you haven't got that ability sometimes with the governistas to have that sort of flexibility, because the executive roles have become, you know, that much more intense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. It's now 2:30. There is a suggestion by Professor Garratt that we take a short break at this time because our session is scheduled to go on until 3:30. And we do need to have some discussions in terms of, and we have several wonderful ideas that came out of this part of the discussion already. What are those things that we could focus on as we move forward with this International Learning Network? And persons who are members of the network are aware, our plan is that we meet every 2 months, that we can have these discussions. So certainly we would want to get persons' ideas in terms of what may be those topics and who may be some speakers, you know, that would help build these kinds of discussions. So I see Ronaele has a question. So yes, Ronaele, we can take your question for David and Professor Garratt.
And Camille has a hand up as well.
If Camille's hand was up before, let her go
Camille,
ahead.
you wanna go? You wanna go first, and then
Yes, I
take
just
Ronaele?
wanted to, the point that David just made is one that I'm grappling with right now. So in public sector, as I mentioned, because of the need for diversity, youth has been put on as one of the criteria. So you're trying to get at least one member who is under 30. And so I serve on some boards and I chair. And so I have under 30. But I'm now considering writing to their employers to let their employers know that they will be giving public service so that they can attend the board meetings. So David, that's a very real point. With young executives and others as well, persons who are in their own businesses, very often they can't afford to spend the time. But because we're thinking that it is a greater good, certainly now from the public sector side, and we are pushing it, then this is what I was thinking that I would do, actually write to their employees to say that they're giving public service in this way and ask them to almost incorporate it as part of, what their job function is. So that's the thinking from my side.
It
Sounds like a great idea. Yeah.
It would be good experience as well to bring them on. There's always, we're back to the case of how do people get experience of being a director so they can learn what being a director is about, learn what boards are about, because so often people are catapulted in very late in their careers and they're used to be an executive, but they suddenly go on a board and it's a very different ballgame.
Yeah. Plus, it's a different world, and we actually need the thinking of the millennials and the younger generation. They see things completely differently.
Yes, agreed. All right, Ronaele?
I had a quick question for David and Professor Garratt. Within the region, we do have, conglomerates who are increasing in strength, and we're proud of their success, and we would like to see them move beyond the region. And to do that, I think an important element is making sure that they have the right governance structures in place, and that those things exist not only at the parent company level, but that they also push those things down to their subsidiaries wherever they fall within the region. I've had the pleasure of working actually with BP subsidiaries, David, for maybe the last 18 years in the region. And I've seen how successfully you have, as a group, ensured that level of training and the contributions of your directors, and the fact that it is reinforced the importance of everyone being prepared, walking into board meetings, understanding not just the subsidiary issues, but the wider global issues that the organization faces. And making sure that we on the ground provide the right level of training and support to the boards, both in terms of what happens centrally and then on an individual territory basis. So that I've seen work very successfully. I'd like some thoughts from you and from others within the region as to how we promote and encourage our own regional conglomerates, our own regional groups, to take on that type of approach and understand the importance of making sure the directors are well prepared, not just at the parent company level, but throughout the organization.
Will I go first, or does Bob want to say something? I'll go. Well, firstly, thank you very much for your very kind comments about BP. We like to think we do think about governments. I say we. It's a very old habit. When you've left there for 2 years, you still say we. Yes. But I think the answer to your question, I think, is in some ways in the question itself, because in this very connected world, you need, if you're sitting in London and you've got subsidiaries around the world, you need to have the right levels of governance and feel that the culture of the organization has gone through successfully, because if there's going to be a problem, it's not going to be in your core company. It's going to be somewhere else in the world. And it's realizing that if you haven't got the right culture, the right governance throughout the group, then the chance of something going wrong, which is going to reverberate back into your hometown and more broadly, is greater. And therefore, it's almost sort of common sense to say we want to run the whole group in one way. So I would have thought that if you're dealing with those companies that are based in your region but have subsidiaries elsewhere, the argument is you're not going to have the problem in the region if they don't operate correctly in a very regulated environment, such as the US or some other parts of the world. The ramifications can be really large for your group of companies. Okay. So it's only right that you run them properly and you think about it carefully, and you have somebody who's doing that who actually understands how companies run. And it's certainly when I was standing back from BP, I know we've run companies successfully in many parts of the world, but it was a topic of conversation amongst a number of the company secretaries in the FTSE 100 that everybody was focusing on subsidiary governance, because they saw that as one of the risks. That's where the risk is, yeah, to their own position. And I think I'd have thought the argument's the same thing.
Agreed. Agreed. I have seen some improvement, certainly among some of our groups who are taking this very seriously and taking the right steps. And there's a lot. There are serious initiatives happening within some of our regional groups, but I still see that there's a need to have further discussion there. Yeah. Thank you.
Can we use that as a bridge? I certainly need a break now, but it's not just that. It's if we take a 50-minute break. Can we use both Ronaele's question and the one that's come up on screen from Peter Crow? Can we use those as a way into where do we go from here? Because the idea of, on the one hand, regional conglomerates and the idea of how do we deal with family companies, etc., I hope it's going to be part of our learning network. So we need to begin to discuss them and then decide with CAMLA a way we can use our very scarce resources, but very intelligent resources to move forward. So shall we take a 15-minute break now?
Yes, agreed.
CAMLA,
sure.
Am I required for the next part? Because I actually have potentially another call at 7 o'clock my time, and if I could be released, I'd be grateful.
Okay, well, yes, absolutely. We are so grateful ourselves for having you today, for doing this presentation with us. We would have loved to have you be part of the conversation to follow, but it's not a one-off event. We will be having these again, and we would certainly hope to have you join us as we continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, please keep me in touch. I've really enjoyed the session. I've enjoyed the questions and just the sheer delight in people being involved in companies and how they work. So if I can be engaged in future, I'd be very happy to do so. And I'd love to join some of your future sessions if that was possible. But I must apologize if I have to leave you now.
Yes, that's all right.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So
indeed.
what time are we rejoining, Kamala?
Yes, so I would suggest a 15-minute break, if that's okay.
So 22 now, so 5 minutes to the hour.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Yes, all right. Now the room is still going to be open, so persons can just mute or take off their videos, but remain in the room, and we'll just resume in the room in 15 minutes time. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.